Hello everyone, it's Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore. Welcome to the MuseScore Café. Today, August 24th, 2022. So today we are going to be looking at some great music engraving improvements in MuseScore 4. I'm really excited to show you some of this. But let me first just give you some additional background for those of you who are new or not new. This is my regular weekly series where we talk about some aspect of making music using MuseScore. And I do this every Wednesday. I've been doing it for some number of years now. In fact, we just hit the 200th episode recently, so that tells me it must be 4 years I've been doing this. Wow. We look at different things, and now with MuseScore 4 coming out, there's all sorts of new things, and I gave a brief overview of like everything. I mean, the whole thing went on for a while, but I didn't have time to go into anything into detail the other week. Today, I want to really focus on music engraving and what it really means in the context of what MuseScore 4 is going to bring to the table. And it's maybe not the world's most exciting topic to think about. Engraving, it sounds like metal plates and things like that, and printing presses. But this is the term that we use in music, not just in MuseScore, to refer to the whole process of how we notate music, the details, the fine details of how big things are relative to other things and how these things are positioned relative to each other. Lots of details. And so I want to tell you, oh, and I left my notes. I have to give me one moment. I will be right back. Just keep introducing yourselves, and I will be back momentarily. There we go. I had written down some notes on things that I wanted to make sure that I got to talk about, and then I realized I left them over on my other table. So, as I was saying here, MuseScore has had a history of improvements in music engraving, and every major release has done something kind of big. And so I want to talk a little bit about some background here so you understand where we're coming from here. MuseScore started off as just a notation feature on a MIDI sequencer. Werner Schwer, the originator of both the Muse sequencer and MuseScore, decided he wanted to have some notation features in his sequencer, Muse, and so he started to just do it as part of Muse, but then he decided to make it a whole separate program called MuseScore. And so MuseScore started off as notation features kind of that were originally going to be bundled in with Muse, and then he separated them out. And he was very fascinated by the idea of music notation and how to do it right, and really tried to do a lot of things the best that he could, and really did a lot well right from the beginning. And that's what became MuseScore 1. In As more and more people started using it, then there were more observations from people about, well, this could work better, and more people got involved. MuseScore 2 improved the engraving a little. I would say there weren't major improvements between MuseScore 2 between MuseScore 1 and MuseScore 2. It was largely the same program as far as that went. The big improvement going to MuseScore 2 was linked parts, the ability to have parts. Like in my MuseScore Café theme here, you can see just the trumpet part, or just the saxophone part, or just the trombone part. And if I change the score, it automatically updates the part, and vice versa. So that was the big thing in MuseScore 2. Not a ton different as far as engraving goes. MuseScore 3 introduced some pretty significant improvements in terms of automatic placement. The idea that in MuseScore 3, for instance, if I zoom in here, and if I wanted to take this measure up an octave, notice the chord symbols kind of go up. They, as the notes go up higher, uh, as the notes go up higher, then the chord symbols move out of their way. That's what automatic placement does. And that was the big thing in MuseScore 3. And so it avoids a lot of collisions, but not necessarily every possible collision in the world, but a lot of them. And like one thing I see right off the bat is these ties here are colliding with that beam. Now maybe that's okay. Not positive if that's actually considered kosher or not. But one thing that I know we've always had problems with has to do with ties. So if I want to take this chord here, let me just do something that I've been meaning to do before I forget. I just want to be logging in on another system here so I can kind of monitor what's happening. If I take this chord here and repeat it and then add ties, notice how this tie is colliding with that dot. And these ties here are colliding with that accidental. Yeah, so these are some things that are not ideal about MuseScore 3's engraving. It did a lot of things better than MuseScore 2, but a lot of things not ideal that you would then have to kind of adjust manually to to get it to really look good. So what MuseScore 4, and before I talk more about MuseScore 4, I just want to talk about MuseScore 3's position in the world also kind of went up with each of these versions, right? With MuseScore 1, it was not taken very seriously. With MuseScore by people who use the big expensive programs. By MuseScore 2 with linked parts, I think people were impressed that MuseScore added linked parts so quickly. Was it took Finale years and years and years to do linked parts. And so once linked parts came in with MuseScore 2, people were like, wow, MuseScore is coming along fast. But it wasn't still seen as a serious competitor until automatic placement came with MuseScore 3, and now it was like, wow, that's something that Sibelius took a long time to do, and Finale still hasn't done. Finale, as far as I know, still does not do this sort of collision avoidance that I showed with the chord symbols moving out of the way, and not just chord symbols, any form of text or whatever. That sort of collision avoidance, as far as I know, is still not a part of Finale. So once MuseScore got that, it was like catching up to uh, Sibelius and kind of passing Finale in some ways. And then people were really like, wow, this is actually like a fairly serious notation program, even though it's free. But of course, people who have invested hundreds of dollars in Finale or Sibelius or Dorico, which is now the other big commercial program that didn't exist when MuseScore first started, um, the people would say, "Well, MuseScore's coming a long ways, but here's what our programs do better." And there's essentially two different things that MuseScore will get criticized for uh, compared to the big expensive ones. One has to do with the playback sounds not being as good, and the other has to do with the engraving, the actual results right out of the box being not as good. Despite a lot of things we do well, like the collision avoidance, there were a lot of things that were seen as being amateurish looking. And so anyone who is really a music engraving snob, or I'll say geek, maybe it's less loaded of a term than snob, anyone who's really tied into the details of music engraving, and this includes anyone who works for a music publisher or produces published printed music for a living, um, then they would be aware of the things that MuseScore didn't do well, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to put a finger on it. They might say, well, MuseScore 3's output just doesn't look as good, and I can't exactly say why. Sometimes people would point to some detail here or other and say, well, I guess this. But you could point to other details about Finale and say, well, Finale is getting some things wrong also. What we've done now in MuseScore 4, so while MuseScore 3 was having its lifespan, as just as it was getting ready to be released, is when the whole changeover in the management. When the original developer Werner and Thomas and Nicola sort of stepped aside and handed over the reins to the people at what was Ultimate Guitar. Now it's Muse Group. Um, so um, the the people at Muse Group really decided they wanted to focus on those two things, on the playback and on the engraving. And at first it was just the playback. But I think Martin, so this guy Tentacruel, that's his handle on Twitter and YouTube, had put out these videos, kind of critiquing different notation programs, and his critique of MuseScore was very to the point, and pointing out some limitations, some not good things, but also pointing out the huge promise that it had, and the Muse group ended up hiring him to be the lead for the whole MuseScore project, and so he has set the direction, and so he has decided to focus on both playback and engraving. So uh, the changes that he brought about started to be seen in MuseScore 3 by the end of, like, by MuseScore 3.5 and then 3.6. You started to see Martin Tentacruel's hand on things, including things like the development of the new notation font that MuseScore uses by default. Here's the default font, Leland, and that was co-developed by Martin and someone else he brought on board, Simon. So Dave is asking, um, oh, Dean, you're in Estes Park. I missed that. I was sort of half seeing the chat here, but I totally didn't see, Dean, that you're in Estes Park today. That's cool. Um, so Dave is asking about drum notation, tablature, etc. So these things are have been. Oh, tablature was a new thing in MuseScore too. So I kind of lied when I said there was no big notational engraving features in MuseScore too. It brought tablature into the fold. So tablature was a new feature in MuseScore too, and it's not been. It's been improved little bits and pieces since then, but um, it's for the most part still in the same form that it was then. Drum notation has been part of MuseScore from the beginning. I don't know that there's been huge significant changes there, tweaks and things here and there. So, what I want to do now is start looking at some of the specific things. I've talked about all this stuff that led to where we are now. But once the MuseScore 4 project started, and initially it was main focus was going to be playback, and still is, frankly, although we're not getting to see the results of that quite yet, because that work is still not completed. The engraving work is, if not completed, at least very demonstratable right now. So I want to show you some of these engraving improvements and talk about what a difference they're actually going to make. So I've put in some music into MuseScore 3 here, that is kind of designed to show off some of the things that maybe we kind of take for granted, that it just looks the way it looks. And I want to show you how much better MuseScore 4 is going to handle these things. So the very first thing you're going to see is in the first measure here. In the first measure, you can see I've got 2/8 notes, E, E, and then 4/8 notes, E, 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 E. And yeah, I'm always sorry when there's technical problems about logging in, and I unfortunately have no control over what happens on anyone else's end. But I'm glad that people were able to find the right place to go and reboot as necessary, or find the appropriate browser to use if one of them's not working. So this is something with all these E's here you might be noticing, and maybe you've noticed it in your scores. Well, why is the length of these stems different? If you have two E's versus you have four E's, why is that different? And the answer is it's just not good. There is no good reason for that to be different. Those should be the same length, and it's really quite distracting. And this particular thing, getting to what Dave mentioned about drum notation, while maybe repeating the same note over and over again isn't so common for most instruments, it's quite common for drums. You're going to keep playing the same drum over and over again, and you're going to have this situation come up a lot, where you have two notes being together and then four of that same note being together also. And it's not that always happens. Like if I take this down a step to D, okay, now they're the same length, and those are the same length. those are the same length, those are the same length, those are the same length, but these aren't, right? So there's certain combinations where MuseScore would just get stem lengths kind of weirdly wrong. And let me make sure I've got my keystroke thing on so you can see what I'm pressing in case it matters. Um, so that's something right there that you can look at and say, well, that's not quite right. Now let's go to the next measure here. In the next measure here, there's a few things that I would point out here. One is these accidentals are causing these eighth notes to need more space than in the first measure. And that's okay. It's okay for accidentals to need more space, but it's actually having um, an odd effect where even eighth notes that are there's there's no accidentals between these two notes. In fact, let me just take this one down a step, right? There's no accidental on those two notes, and yet they are farther apart than uh, these two notes are, right? They are just farther apart for not really any good reason. When I add the accidental, it gets further still. Why does adding an accidental to this D increase the space after it? It makes no logical sense, but it's just a fact of how the algorithm was written. So the algorithm, as I mentioned, was originated way back, like 20 years ago when Werner started this, and a lot of things were improved over the years, but these two basic fundamental things, which work okay, I mean, it's readable, but it's just not quite right. And so the beam algorithm, choosing how long the stem should be and what the angle of the beam should be, and the spacing algorithm did a decent job. It at least gives eighth notes less space than quarter notes, more space than 16th notes. It knows a lot of things, but there's a lot of details that it's not quite getting right. Also, notice this slur here is it's actually not as bad as it was before. I've been, oh, there we go. When it's an E flat, look at that. Look at how close that slur is to that E right now. So pay attention to that. Now, in this measure here, look at these at the 16th notes going up here. The 16ths going up here are covering like an octave and a half, and the beam is not as steep as the notes, but it's still pretty steep. It's almost, if you look at the bottom of this beam here, it's on the B line, and look at the bottom of the next beam, it's almost up to the F line. This is almost 2 staff spaces tall. That's a pretty steep beam angle, and it's steeper than most engravers recommend. And so the algorithm for choosing how steep to make the angle also is not terrible, but it's not great either. But now look what's happening to the spacing in this measure. We have 16th notes here, and the 16th notes require a certain amount of space, and then therefore the quarter note needs to have more space than the 16ths. But then in the next measure, you can see when a measure that just has 4 quarter notes, these quarter notes are closer together than these quarter notes. In other words, yes, we needed to add more space after the quarter note compared to the 16th, but we've added too much space compared to how much space the quarter notes in the next measure need. The quarter notes in this measure should be the same as the quarter notes in that measure in terms of the amount of space, just as the eighth notes, let me change this back to just a plain E. The eighth notes in this measure should need the same amount of space as the eighth notes in that measure, and it's just not happening. So these are all kind of fundamental things about music notation, about engraving, these details of how your score looks that, I mean, this happens over and over, these things. The length of stems, the angle of the beams. I mean, all music has stems and beams. We're not talking about obscure features here. We're talking about something that each and every measure of your score has notes with stems and probably some notes with beams, and it's got space between those notes, and it's been wrong. for lack of a better word. It's just been not good all of these years. Um, so let's see what Dave's asking here about the middle of the rest on the staff below. That's a good question. Which rest are you talking about? These rests are supposed to be centered. These are measure rests, so it should be centered within the measure. And as far as I know, that is correct. There could be some optical illusions here, and I am going to talk about an optical illusion that MuseScore 4 deliberately creates to improve some things. But as far as I know, these are correctly centered, I believe. But what I'm going to do now is just pull the curtain down and let's look at MuseScore 4's. Whoops, that's not what I want to show you. I want to show you MuseScore 4. I want to show you MuseScore 4's version of this same example. And let's compare. All right, so first thing we see. So under the third beat. Okay, so that's actually a good question, and this is good to clarify. No, the measure rest is supposed to be centered in a measure. That doesn't mean place it underneath the middle beat of the measure, because in this case the first half of the measure takes more space than the second half because it's full of 16th notes. This needs to be exactly centered between the bar lines. The measure rest should be exactly centered between the bar lines, and yeah, that won't mean it's aligned with any particular beat. It's a very special thing about measure rests that they're supposed to be centered. All right, so again, let's come back to MuseScore 4 here. So that first measure, remember the inconsistent stem lengths here? That's no longer the case. Your stem lengths now on passages like this will be much more accurate, much more consistent. In the next measure, notice, remember, so first of all, let me change this back to an E. When this is up to an E, remember in MuseScore 3, these two E's were spaced more widely than these two E's. And the reason is because of these accidentals. These accidentals are causing more space to be needed elsewhere in the measure, but they're also having an effect on those two E's when they shouldn't. They were causing these two E's to be further apart. Well, in MuseScore 4, that's no longer the case. The accidentals in the second half of the measure are adding space in the second half of the measure, but the first half of the measure, the spacing is the same as the previous measure. So accidentals add space as needed, but they don't add space where not needed. I cannot emphasize how important that is to proper music engraving and uh, how much heat MuseScore has taken over the years from people who are like professional music engravers or want to become professional music engravers or want their music to be, published or taken seriously by, the music publishing community or whatever, that these details matter. And MuseScore has been taking so much heat for this over the years. And to see this fixed is like just like practically brings tears to my eyes. And so, Dave, yes, if half rest, absolutely anything but measure rests are supposed to be aligned according to the beat they occur on. But the measure rest, the rest that occurs in an empty measure, is special. It's centered. And that's how you know the difference between this and a whole rest. A whole rest looks the same as that, but it is left aligned. A whole rest always takes exactly 4 beats, and it is aligned with its beat. But a measure rest doesn't take exactly 4 beats, it just fills the measure. And if it happens to be 4/4, then it happens to be 4 beats. But in 3/4, a measure rest is 3 beats. In 5/4, it's 5 beats, etc. So measure rests always fill the measure and are always centered. They are special. All other rests line up with their beats. Okay, so moving on a little bit, in this, what did I do? When this E was an E flat is when this slur was too close to those notes. Let me see what happens here. When I make this E an E flat, did that affect that slur? No, it didn't make that slur too close to the notes. The number of slur improvements is really large, but they're individual little things that are kind of hard to show. But it has to do with details like in MuseScore 3, we kind of force the slur to start close to this note head, even though that makes a bad shaped slur. Here, we allow the slur to move further from the note head in MuseScore 4, and because it just creates a better look overall. Now, MuseScore 3 doesn't always force the slur close to the note head. It does allow it to float some. It just doesn't do as good a job of it as it should. So MuseScore 4 is going to improve a ton about this. So wrong note. Oh yes. Thank you. So measure three, which I'm about to get to. Oh crap. So MuseScore 4, um, is still an alpha and will crash occasionally. So I just crashed MuseScore 4. No panic. But I am bummed that my example I didn't save first. So I'm going to have to see if the restore session works. I haven't actually used that much. Yay. All right. And oops. I meant this. I'm trying to size this. There we go. And then we close my side panels. Oops. All right. Better. Okay. So, yes. Unfortunately, the arrow keys I've noticed are one of the things. If you try to change the pitch of a note with the arrow keys, it works sometimes and crashes sometimes. Um, but I originally had it one way and then I changed it, and obviously I didn't change it in both of them. Okay, so what's happening here now is the spacing has been equalized some. There's a little less space between the quarter notes in measure 3 than there was in MuseScore 3. There's a little more space in measure 4 than there was in MuseScore 3, so that the spacing of the quarter notes is more consistent between here. And we can I yeah, not worth the effort. Just do that. I was going to try to again get it positioned the way I had it before. So this more equal spacing is really big. The thing is, you don't notice it until you do, and then you can't unsee it. Is the way this typically works. Um, the spacing is like an important part of how we read rhythm. Really. See you later, Colleen. Have fun at your other class. Music spacing affects how we read rhythms. We sort of expect when we see notes a certain distance apart that they're going to be a certain rhythm. And it does mess with the brain a little bit when it's inconsistent. You see some eighth notes that are a certain distance apart, and then the next measure you see notes that are wider apart. Your brain doesn't as quickly process that they're eighth notes. Yes, you're eventually going to get it. But that momentary, wait a minute, what's going on? These must be longer than the notes I just played, is just enough to sort of like sow a seed of doubt in your brain and cause you to mess something up when you're sight reading. So important. I'm not saying every single time people are going to sight read wrong because the spacing's off, but I mean, no, it just increases the likelihood of error in sight reading if you don't get the details right. So the degree to which these details are improved is just really hard to overstate. Really hard to overstate because these details matter, and this really nails them. And this is largely thanks to a couple of people, and I want to shout out to a few people here specifically. So one of them is Simon Smith, who is the engraving expert. He works for or worked for, now he works for MuseScore, or the Muse group. Uh, yeah, now I've actually forgotten which publisher he worked for, so I'm not gonna screw that up. Simon, if you happen to be watching, feel free to check in here. I know he's checked out the cafe some before, um, but so he has done a really good job of sort of prioritizing what needs fixing, and then there there was also a user, a guy named Barney Snyman, who was really, I think, instrumental in alerting people to problems. He just, was posting bug reports about, well, why is this, why are the accidentals adding space here, and why are the 16th notes causing these quarter notes to be wider, and he was posting bug reports about this, and a couple of years ago, when I was more actively doing development, I tried. I was trying to figure out how to fix some of these things, and just couldn't. I just couldn't get it done. There were issues that prevented it from being done. It just wasn't going to happen. Um, but I was able to at least identify what would need to happen. I was able to say, well, here's what the algorithm is doing now, and here's how the algorithm would have to be redone to make those things better. Well, someone else came on board originally as a volunteer, named Mike. Well, if he's Italian, it's Michele Spagnolo, but he goes by Mike also. And he came on board originally as a volunteer, saying, "I think I can fix that spacing thing," and did some work, and then got hired also. And a couple other people, someone else who I just know by his handle on on the Discord, which is just the letter A. So I guess that's his initial. And Marla's talking about the spacing, I guess, between this A and the C here as being a little too close. And yeah, that is probably the thing is it's supposed to be um, you know, based on the spacing is supposed to be based on the note that came before it. You shouldn't necessarily add more space after the A, but subjectively you can certainly do things like that. But I don't think there's anything incorrect about this. The amount of space after that A is good. Um, so anyhow, those are some of the people that we have to thank for these improvements. But I want to go a little deeper also and show some more things here. So one of the things I want to show you has to do with measure 2 here. And what I want to do is I'm going to add some more notes to this measure in the first beat here. And let's see what I'm going to add some 16th notes. And now I want to add some same 16th notes in this measure. And I'm going to so this is a weird shape slur. I'm not saying things are perfect here. But let me get rid of that slur for a second. I'm I'm trying to make something happen that you'll understand in a moment. So let me just make some more changes. That didn't do me any favors. All right, what I'm going to try to make the same changes now to the other one so I can show you what I'm going for here. Get rid of the slur. Make these be 2/8 notes. All right, let's talk about what's happening here. This is another thing that when Werner was working on MuseScore, uh, actually during the development of MuseScore 3, along with automatic placement, he tried to implement something that he basically got working, but it worked too well for its own good and caused problems. And it has to do with the difference between this measure and this measure here. And yeah, it is now distracting me that I can't get both windows on screen at the same time the way I wanted. So there we go. All right. Um, this sharp sign here has plenty of room to tuck underneath that A, right? The low A sharp, that sharp sign has plenty of room to tuck underneath that A, but it's not doing it. And this was a problem in MuseScore 1, was a problem in MuseScore 2. During the development of MuseScore 3, Werner fixed that so that it would tuck under. But unfortunately, it tucked under so well that it actually would collide with the stem of the note before it. And so he couldn't figure out, or none of us could figure out, I should say, because then I worked on it also, and none of us could figure out how to get that sharp sign to tuck underneath the A, but not also collide with the stem. Has to do with the way MuseScore's algorithms work, because basically you don't know the stem direction right away. You don't know the stem direction of all the notes until you're done with the measure, because you don't know how far the beam is going to go, and the beam can influence stem directions. It's complicated, but basically at the time when we would have needed to know that that sharp can tuck under the A, we don't know what direction that stem is in. Because if that stem was above, then it could tuck. If the stem was going up instead of down, then it would be totally safe to tuck that sharp under. So in MuseScore 4, you can see that now we do that. The sharp sign does tuck underneath the A. I mean, not all the way underneath because the measure's not crowded enough to need it. But if it was crowded enough to need it, it would go more. In fact, if I flip the stem above, no, that didn't actually help. It didn't help at all. But in any case, this is definitely an improvement here. And someone was asking or talking about getting more measures uh, per per system. Yeah, the bottom line here is that MuseScore 3 and all versions of MuseScore up through MuseScore 3 would, generally speaking, add too much space for things. There were other places where it would allow collisions where it shouldn't, but in general, it would just be too conservative, add too much space. MuseScore 4 is being much more accurate about how much space is actually needed and only adding the needed amount of space. So, in general, yes, you can expect many scores to need less space. All right. And now the next observation Dave makes about beams is a really good one. And this is a thing. So I mentioned that this beam was probably too much. It's too much um, because it really shouldn't go much more than a staff space. And here you'll see it doesn't. It's almost flat. Now some people would say this is actually too flat, and there's definitely room for subjectivity. But MuseScore's beams were definitely, by any measure, too steep. And that steepness comes at a big price. And this was something that Simon was very big on wanting to fix. And this required completely rewriting the beam algorithm. The beam algorithm, I did a little work on beams in MuseScore 3, and I have to tell you, was the hardest part of the code by far to understand. The beam code was almost like just completely inscrutable. I mean, I could make it was just like math, numbers and equations and things. It wasn't logic. It was and if you haven't done much programming, maybe the distinction I'm making doesn't make sense. But just trust me, it was really hard to understand code, really hard to make changes to it without breaking other things. And so there was a lot of changes that I might have wanted to make to beaming that I couldn't. So for MuseScore 4, someone, I can't remember if it was Mike or if it was that other guy A or someone else, just basically ripped out all the beam code and rewrote it from scratch. So this beam here is within the realm of what many people would say is correct, even if it subjectively seems on the flat side. But I want to change something here to show you why it's the way it is as I'm transposing it. Look at what is showing through the beams here. The staff line is showing through. That is incorrect. That is what you're not supposed to allow. Staff lines should not show between the beams. These are called wedges when this happens. And this has been a time-honored principle of music engraving back to the music engraving days of actual printing presses, because the ink, it just wouldn't, you would end up with situations where the ink would just blur and it would fill in and you'd get a big blob there. So this is why traditionally beams have been made to be mostly flat, so that you don't get beams, you don't get the staff line showing through the beams. This is what's wrong. It's subjective to some extent what the angle actually is, but what's not subjective is you're not allowed to have those staff lines showing through. Now, it's unavoidable that maybe if it's like a long enough beam, somewhere in the middle, the staff line might show through. But where possible, you're supposed to flatten the beam so that the staff line doesn't show through. And so you'll see if I do this in MuseScore 3 and select these notes here and start moving them down, that depending on where it is, sometimes the beam will show through in the middle. I mean, the staff line shows through in the middle. Sometimes it shows through at the beginning and at the end, but the beam is pretty much always showing through. I mean, I keep saying beam, I mean staff line. In this version, though, no matter what I do, the beam stays clear of the staff line, and that is what you want. The beam should stay clear of the staff line. That's the way notation is supposed to work. Now, will the beams ever get steeper than this? Yeah, if I keep, transposing notes further up, like here, now the notes are as steep as they're ever allowed to be, which is this much, 1.5 staff spaces. That is as steep as a beam is ever allowed to be, 1.5 staff spaces, and you should only do that if the whole beam is outside the staff, because otherwise you're going to get a staff line poking through. So these are all rules that are laid forth in a book called The Art of Music Engraving by Ted Ross, long out of print, but this is the book that all music engravers for decades now have been referring to, and all music notation software has been referring to where possible, and we've never had access to that book before. But Simon has it and knows it, and he is the one that laid out the rules for how this should work. So once you're used to the two steep beams, the flatter beams do look a little odder, but this is as steep a beam as you're ever supposed to allow. So, uh, so yes, the idea is, yes, stems are supposed to show through. Stems absolutely should show through. The issue isn't just about showing through, it's the wedge is actually the term that gets used. So when we come back to MuseScore 3 here, the wedge is what happens when you have not only a stem but also a staff line. So you have this collision of like all these different elements, beam, two different beams plus a staff line plus a stem. All of those things coming together creates this little triangle in here and this little wedge there. That's what you're avoiding. Having staff line showing crashed again. Having staff line show through is uh, um, is having staff lines show through causes the wedges. Having the stems show through will not cause a wedge if there's no staff line showing through. And so that is why that is how the rule works. And so again, I didn't make these rules up. Ted Ross didn't make them up either. He just did a really good job of explaining them. Um, mm, mm, mm. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of all the side panels and I forget which shortcut is which. Need to get rid of instruments. There we go. Okay. Um, so yeah, it's just incorrect to blot out the stems. So it isn't MuseScore making this up. This is the way you could go back hundreds of years and examine scores under under a magnifying glass, and you'll see that they do the same thing. And it also has to do with things like exactly where the beam starts relative to the note, relative to the staff line. Beams either are supposed to touch the staff line or exactly center on the staff line. They're not supposed to just float, the ends of the beams I'm talking about. They're not supposed to float in the space because that'll create a weird little gap above and below. So beams, the ends of the beams need to either exactly touch the staff line or exactly straddle it. And so that is a rule that we did follow before, and that's also a way of reducing the occurrence of these wedges. Um, but um, yeah, so these are the techniques that Music Engraving has used, and Simon worked for a music publisher and was very conversant with all of this. And yeah, so that the link there to the Music Engraving text, yeah, and you can generally find it used places also, and libraries have it. I'm not saying it's impossible to get, but it's out of print, and therefore it's hard or expensive to get. And because we also have Elaine Gould's Behind Bars, and she summarizes the Ted Ross rules and then says for more information see Ted Ross, we considered that good enough. And really the beam algorithm was written before Elaine Gould's book even came out, before Behind Bars was published. So I want to keep going here and show a couple other things, because there's still yet more to talk about here. I mentioned the optical illusion thing. I'm going to now do um, uh, what is this called? Cross staff notation. Cross staff notation. Um, and I think the example that I chose, of course, I've messed it all up now. All right, I'm going to select this, move it down, select that, move it down, select that, move it down. Um, Obviously, I've changed the pitches again, so this version, let me do the same thing. E, A, E, A. E, A, E, A. All right, look at the spacing here in MuseScore 3, and let's compare it to the spacing in MuseScore 4. What happened in MuseScore 3 is this is crazy here. What happened is MuseScore 3 is spacing the notes by the center of the note heads. That's normally correct, but when you have mixed stem directions, it looks weird. It looks wrong. Can you have cross-staff notation across three staves for organ? Yes, in theory, and MuseScore kind of sort of supports it barely. It works if you put the notes on the middle staff and then go up and down from there. I haven't done much with it, but I'm sure it's existed, but organ music typically wouldn't do that because the bottom staff is exclusively for the pedals, and the pedals would almost never be playing 16th notes or need to be beamed with the hands, right? You'd beam the hands together because realistically, this is all played, could be all played with one hand, but you'd almost never beam the foot pedals with the other notes. So in any case, this looks weird. This little gap, right? If now that we're, we don't have wedges, but we have these spaces between the stems, these stems are way close together, and it makes this look weird and wrong. And that's because MuseScore 3 is spacing note head to note head. And under normal circumstances, that's what you want. But with cross staff notation, that's wrong. And cross staff notation is important for both piano, organ, and harp, right? So what MuseScore 4 does is it's in cross staff notation spaces by stems. So the stems are all the same distance apart. Now, in this particular case, this actually looks a little weird to me. It looks like there's actually too much space here, but this also has to do with the fact that this E has a ledger line after it, and it's increasing the spacing some more. If I change that to, say, a B, and moved it down, I think that's, or even an A, you know, it depends on what the pitches actually are, but the idea that the stems are what you're supposed to space, this is a detail that professional music engravers know, but most music notation software doesn't get right. This is going to be one of the areas where, again, we're going to kind of leapfrog some of the other programs that don't know how to do this. It's called optical spacing. It's spacing not based on the note head, but based on the stems in this particular case. There's tons more details that I could get into here, and I'm going to get into some of them. Let me show you one right now. I'm going to select this measure here and add a break, and I'm going to add some notes. And I'm going to add 16th notes here, and then half notes everywhere else. Maybe just a whole note here, and a whole note there. Obviously, the 16th note measure requires more space than the others. So that, and actually this, well, we'll find out if this is going to work. This spacing is totally correct. But those people who are used to working from handwritten jazz charts, in when in the world of handwritten music notation, which it goes beyond jazz, it's also how a lot of like Broadway shows, because they would have to, you'd be cranking out these scores pretty quickly and having to crank out the parts pretty quickly because, show's going to happen like, weeks, just a matter of days after the music is finished, the rehearsals are going to start, right? I mean, they're all, at least traditionally, were done on an incredibly fast schedule. And so when you're handwriting charts, it's really hard to calculate the spacing for this. And so a tradition exists in the world of handwritten music to just say, hey, let's make all the measures on a system the same width. And then we'll just let these measures be wider than they need to be. It's not just about make simplicity though. It also has to do with things like chord symbols. If I put chord symbols every 2 beats, I've got chord symbols every 2 beats. Someone reading the chord symbols, which is totally the way it would be done. I mean, if you're the guitar player or the pianist reading a lead sheet, you're not looking at the notes on the staff so much. The saxophonist or the singer, someone else is dealing with the notes on the staff. You're just playing from the chords. And again, the spacing here is way off. I'm going to look at the chords and say, well, these 2 chords must last a long time. These chords must last a shorter amount of time because the spacing is so erratic. So MuseScore 1 had an option to force all measures the same width, but it didn't work well. It would allow the notes to, it would just put too many measures it would let the notes overlap, basically, or the notes run off the end of the system, and it would also not account for the clef at the beginning of the system correctly, lots of other things. And Humble Music was asking about facing the notes in the other direction. Now, if you mean something like taking this A and actually flipping it to the other side of the stem like that, that's not really cool. But yeah, it's done occasionally just to sort of make things look a little different. If that's what you mean, not sure if it is or not. But yeah, there's games that people will play with that. Anyhow, so this is correct spacing normally. Um, where those 16ths take all that extra space. But MuseScore 4 now has a new style setting that's useful for 2 purposes, and I want to show you both of these purposes because they're both kind of cool. If I go to Format, Style, Measure, there's this thing that says Spacing Ratio. This basically controls how much more space does a quarter note need compared to an eighth note, or a half note compared to a quarter note. A half note doesn't normally use twice as much space as a quarter note. It uses uh, 1.5 times as much space. So this ratio has to do with that. A half note shouldn't be twice as much space as a quarter, but only 1.5 times as more. If I turn this all the way down to the minimum, which is 1, let's take a look at my score now. It didn't actually work, and I was afraid of that because of those 16ths. So you'll have to ignore what I just said. Um, Let me undo that for a second. Uh, I I probably am overstating exactly what this setting is going to do anyhow. But the point is that this ratio is a new setting that's very useful for some purposes, special purpose. Oh, two, I went the wrong way. There's the setting that I wanted. I went the wrong direction. So the two setting now, notice what it did. And it's going to have a similar issue of, well, it's not really a similar issue. Now it's just that those notes won't all fit. That's too much. Let me change this to just a quarter note. Change this one to quarter note. Wow, it's really having trouble. Huh. Well, at least this way it works. It didn't work with the 16th notes, but at least you can see now that with that setting, all the measures are the same width. If I go back to Format, Style, because yeah, those 16th notes maybe just were too much space. Um, but if I go back there, Format, Style, Measure, and set that back to the default, the quarter note measure gets wider and all the other measures get narrower in comparison. But with it turned all the way up to 2, then that changed it. So anyhow, the ratio, the way MuseScore does its algorithm for spacing things lets you play with things like that. The other thing that you're going to get by turning the spacing ratio up to 2 is if you turn the spacing ratio up to 2, it now means that from system to system, the measures are going to be consistent. And so if I enter some eighth notes into this measure, measure beat 2, beat 3 on this system lines up with beat 3 on the next system. So this isn't normally something you strive for, but again, in this world of jazz and chord symbols or Broadway shows with rhythm sections reading chord symbols, it is actually pretty useful. And also in educational materials, this idea that we might want to have an example on one system and then the next system show that same example but with some modification, and you want everything to line up from system to system even though they're not played at the same time, but you want people to be able to compare system to system to see, hey, look, yeah, you can change a half note into eighth notes and have everything still line up. This spacing ratio will allow you to achieve that. So there's tons more improvements that I could show, lots of small details. Um, but there's one thing that I haven't looked, there's two things that I haven't looked at before, and I saw on the list of improvements, and I want to try them out for you right now. So one of them has to do with header and footer. So I'm going to go to Format, Style, and I'm going to put some information in my footer. I'm going to say, let's show it on the first page. Let's not worry about different first and I'm just going to put, this is a footer. All right, that's good. Now, um, can I get there by double clicking? I think I used to be able to, but I guess not now. Um, I'm now going to play with that footer some and see what happens and see if the thing that he just said is going to happen. Oh, yeah, look at that. As you make your footer taller, it creates room for it. This People who do things with like long copyright messages at the bottom of a score, um, I want to show it on the first page, and maybe you know there it is on the next page also, right? So if I've got that on the first page, now if I have it set so it only shows on the first page, then it's only going to need that extra space on the first page. So it didn't used to be the case. So you'd have all sorts of cases where your footer was crashing into your music if you had a long footer or a long header. And so now it's automatically going to add space. I'm looking forward to that. Here's the next one I'm looking forward to, and someone just asked about this on the forum. I'm going to create a new score. And yes, when you create a new score in MuseScore 4, separate scores will be in separate windows, so you can easily Alt-Tab between them, which is kind of nice, but will take some getting used to if you're used to just clicking on the tabs to switch between scores. Now it's Alt-Tab with your keyboard to switch between scores. I'm going to create a score using the Choral SATB plus piano template. And I am now going to add a rehearsal mark right here. And I'm going to see what happens. Huh, look at that. Y'all see what happened? It shows up both on the top staff and on the piano staff. So this is a feature that's tied to certain templates in which they sort of pre-configured to do this. Eventually, it's going to be possible to decide for yourself which stave should get this. But the choral template has it, and if I go and create an orchestra score, I think we'll find the orchestra score has it too. So this is something that people have been requesting for a long time. And let's just go ahead with classical orchestra. And same thing. I'm going to zoom way down so I can see. And now I'm just going to enter, this time I'm going to enter a tempo marking. And sure enough, there it is. It's there on the flutes, and it's repeated above the strings. So rehearsal marks, tempo marks, fine, all the sorts of things that normally appear just at the top of a score and then on all the parts, those are called system markings, will now also be repeated where they should. Namely, on orchestral scores, they'll be repeated above the string section, and on choral scores will be repeated on the piano part. So that's another nice new feature. And yeah, tons of other smaller improvements. They've made tons of improvements to the font, um, the Leland, the notation font, lots of little details of the shapes of beams. I mean, not the beams, the flags, other things too. But I think I have now at least covered most of the main things that I wanted to cover. I'll show you one other thing because I referenced it earlier, but then never showed an example of it. I want to show what happens with tied notes now and dots. If I enter a chord, dotted G, and then tie this thing, you'll see that now the ties are avoiding the dots, right? So that we don't have that collision that we saw in MuseScore 3 where the ties were running into the dots. I think the same is true if I get rid of this and I turn this into an eighth note. Well, that's just weird to turn it into an eighth note, but let me uh, I want to see if the tie is going to collide with the flag or not because I actually don't know. And I actually don't know if it's a problem or not. But we're going to try it anyhow. So I'm going to select this thing, tie, and yeah, the tie has avoided the flag as well. So yeah, a lot of little details of things like this are improved also. So anyhow, what's going to happen now is your music is just going to look better right off the bat. It's going to look better in so many ways that used to require manual adjustments to make happen, and now it's just going to be there. And yeah, I'm just extremely looking forward to these improvements and the difference they're going to make in my own scores. So, hope you've enjoyed and gotten something out of some of this demonstration here. And I think now I'm going to return to MuseScore 3 to play my theme because MuseScore 4 plays a little funny. It's got some issues still with its playback. That's not totally completed yet. Oh yeah, there we are. So come back to the cafe theme was playing very strangely in the alpha. They fixed most of the bugs that I reported based on the cafe theme playing funny. The swing 16th notes didn't work out right with ties, but there's still some remaining issues with how the fretless bass plays, with how that fall plays. Oh, that's another improvement. That fall will play without needing this invisible gliss and things. So there's tons of playback improvements that I will be thrilled to be showing you once they're a little more together. But anyhow, this has been the MuseScore Cafe, all about the engraving improvements in MuseScore 4. And yeah, there's subtle things, but they add up to so much that your scores are just going to look better. Just without you having to do a thing, your scores are just going to look better. It's going to make Finale and Sibelius users envious of everything that we can do now for free and that they have to pay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for, and then keep paying hundreds of dollars every year to maintain their subscriptions to get updates. And it's just crazy how unbelievably good MuseScore 4 is going to be at this sort of stuff compared to these expensive commercial programs and how much MuseScore gives you for free. So I'm just really excited to be sharing in this and showing you what other people have done. I have done very little of this work other than having laid some of the groundwork during MuseScore 3 to make it possible. But it's really these other people I'm talking about, Martin, Simon, Mike, and Casper, a couple other people who have done some of this development work, and I thank them so much. Thank you all so much for being here. What is that last chord doing there? That's weird. Oh, I must have added it when I was testing the tie. Anyhow, thanks everyone, and I will hopefully see most of you next week. See some of you tomorrow for the music masterclass, and talk to you soon.